introduction to Jeremiah. Introduce this prophet. Second of our three major prophets. Memory verse 228. Found twice in the book, I think another time over in chapter 11, but 228. Kind of the theme, very sarcastic theme here of Jeremiah and of Jeremiah's book. But where are thy gods that thou hast made thee? Let them arise that they can save thee in the time of thy trouble. For according to the number of thy cities are thy gods, O Judah. Jeremiah said, as many cities as you have in Judah, you have gods, your patron god of each city. And now the time of your trouble has come, and where are all those gods that you've made yourself? Let them arise and see if they can save you in the day of your trouble. It does say it again over in chapter 11, verse 13. For according to the number of thy cities were thy gods, O Judah. And according to the number of the streets of Jerusalem have you set up altars to that shameful thing, even altars to burn incense unto Baal. Now that's over in 11:13 if you didn't get that. But 228 puts it a little more poetically and therefore a little easier to memorize. Where are thy gods that thou hast made thee? Let them arise that they can save thee in the time of thy trouble. For according to the number of thy cities are thy gods, O Judah. So you can see that the recipient of Jeremiah's prophecy is Judah, just like with Isaiah. He was writing unto Judah, and so is Jeremiah. Now we'll start off here with some biographical information of the prophet himself. We have more information, more biographical information about this prophet than any other prophet in the Old Testament. A lot of Isaiah's book was spent on prophesying about future things, and the prophet himself was more or less removed from the scene, and it was simply prophecies brought forth. But time and time again, Jeremiah is brought into the whole story and into the events that are transpiring. And you don't see just chapter after chapter after chapter of prophecy with the prophet removed into the background. You see him there on the scene. His name is mentioned time and time again in his book, where you don't see that in Isaiah. You just see Isaiah and his name mentioned a couple of times. You don't see Isaiah talking about himself that much, whereas you see Jeremiah talking constantly about himself from the first chapter to the last one. 52 chapters, but remember it's longer than the 66 of Isaiah. And it's longer than the 48 of Ezekiel, which makes it the longest prophet in the Old Testament. His name means Yahweh founds or establishes.
Hallelujah.
Jeremiah, Yahweh founds or establishes. His father's name, we see from chapter 1, was Hilkiah. Now this is not to be confused with Hilkiah the high priest, because this Hilkiah is a priest, which makes Jeremiah a priest. Remember, a few of the prophets have kingly backgrounds, a few have priestly backgrounds, royal backgrounds and priestly backgrounds. Jeremiah is one who has a priestly background. His father was a priest, which would make him also a priest. But he's a prophet at the same time, which makes him a little unusual as far as the Old Testament prophets were concerned. But this is not to be confused with 2 Kings 22 Hilkiah, who comes on the scene right during the time of Jeremiah's ministry, which we'll mention and I'll show you on the chart here in a few moments. But that Hilkiah was the great Hilkiah, the great high priest, and he was involved in the Reformation during Josiah's time. But Jeremiah's father's name was Hilkiah. Besides this, we don't know anything else about him. He did happen to have the same name as the great high priest who was living during this time. Now, we're seeing this in chapter 1 and verse 1. Along with that, Jeremiah from the little village several miles northeast of Jerusalem called Anathoth. First verse, Jeremiah 1:1. several miles walk northeast of Jerusalem. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests that were in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. And remember, Benjamin was just a little bit north of Judah, and Jerusalem was more or less on the boundary between Judah and Benjamin, which means that this little place of Anathoth was just a little bit northeast of Judah and Jerusalem, and it was up in the tribe of the territory that had originally belonged to Benjamin. So he's a Benjamite. In other words, since he is living in this area, we can call him a Benjamite. Jeremiah ben Hilkiah, the Benjamite, but he's a priestly Benjamite. We see from verse, 4 through 7, that he's called when he is very young. Some of the prophets like Amos are called when they're older in life. Most of them we don't know when they're called. They just are on the scene and they're prophesying. But a few of them we are given some information concerning how young they were when they were called. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, this is the year 627 B.C., before I formed thee in the belly I knew thee, and before thou camest forth out of the womb I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. Then said I, Ah, Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a child. But the Lord said unto me, Say not, I am a child, for thou shalt go to all that I shall send thee, and whatsoever I command thee thou shalt speak. Now let's turn back. I want to show you something in 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 2. Now this doesn't mean that he is a 6 and 7 year old child. When it uses the word child like this, it can refer, now don't get me wrong, it can refer to a 6 or 7 year old. You have to determine by the context. But it also can refer to a young man, a young teenage man, or a man in his early 20s, a young fellow, in other words. Now this is the same way the word is used in 2 Kings 2 in verse 24, where you've got 42 children. No, they're 42 young fellows, young men here, who were following the prophet Elisha and mocking him. And Elisha turned back and looked on them and cursed them in the name of the Lord, and there came forth 2 she-bears out of the wood and tare 42 children of them. But these aren't 5 and 6 year old children here. These are 18, 19, 20 year old young men. And so the word is used in the same sense in Jeremiah 1 and verse 6 when he complains more or less back to God, Behold, I am nothing but a child. Because, of course, age was something important it still is in your Oriental countries, which, of course, Palestine is considered an Oriental country, and age is something important. You're not an adult just because you're 21 and you get a driver's license or something like that. You become a man, when you can prove that you're a man. And age is something that's looked upon with reverence, as we're told in the Scriptures, to rise up in the presence of an old man. Of course, there's not many today that deserve our rising up in their presence. But it is a biblical concept, and it certainly is a true concept, one that we don't have in this country, and the emphasis placed on the desirability of old age. But it's a desirability of young age, or at least how young you can look whenever you are old. So this is a complaint of his that he's a child because of the emphasis on old age. Who's going to listen to 20-year-old prophesying here? No one will. Because everything is geared towards the old people, because they're the ones who would have the wisdom. So they would claim anyway. So Jeremiah said, I couldn't speak. In other words, they wouldn't let me speak. I'm a child compared to them. I'm 20 years old. I'm a child compared to them. But God said, I'm the one that separated you and ordained you to be a prophet, and therefore I'm the one that will make sure that what you say comes to pass. Chapter 16 and verse 2. Another one of the unusual features of his ministry was that he was commanded not to marry. So Jeremiah stayed single his whole life. The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Thou shalt not take thee a wife, neither shalt thou have sons or daughters in this place. Now, some people have interpreted that to mean that once Jerusalem fell and Judah fell and was carried captive into Babylon, and then Jeremiah was free from that part of his ministry of denouncing the people for their sins, and of course he ended up in Egypt, then he could marry, because it says, "Thou shalt not have sons or daughters in this place." But it seems, the implication seems to be that he was to remain a celibate all of his life. "Thou shalt not take thee a wife, neither shalt thou have sons or daughters in this place or in any other place." He had a personal secretary, an amanuensis, who's famous in the Old Testament, whose name is Baruch, because the Catholics have a book by him. He is seen, well, I'll just wait till we get over there. He's seen in several places later on in the book. His name appears. Chapter 36 is, I guess, where he's seen the most, because this is the time, well, we'll just turn over there and look at that for a moment. This is the time where he is called by Jeremiah to write out the prophecies that Jeremiah has given. Now, no doubt, many of the other prophets had their amanuenses along with them, but their name simply doesn't pop up and appear like Jeremiah's does. Over in the New Testament, Paul more than once had an amanuensis with him. Peter had an amanuensis with him. And so a lot of the New Testament apostles, whenever they were writing, had an amanuensis and a personal secretary that actually did their writing for them as they dictated to them what should be written. Paul in Romans chapter 16 had Tertius, who was his amanuensis. Peter in 1 Peter had Silvanus, the same person as Silas, the Silas that traveled with Paul, as his amanuensis. So Jeremiah, he's got the most famous of the amanuenses, Baruch, because he's got a book in the Apocrypha named after him. It came to pass, 36:1, Jeremiah 36:1. The 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, that this word came unto Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Take thee a roll of a book, and write therein all the words that I have spoken unto thee against Israel and against Judah and against all the nations, from the day I spake unto thee, from the days of Josiah, even unto this day. I believe we didn't read that 3rd verse back in chapter 1, but it tells, I think, from the 13th year of Josiah was when he began prophesying. Let's see, 2nd verse. To whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. So he does give us a few dates on his prophecies. Not one of the most dated ones here, but he does give us a few dates, and he tells us that he started in the 13th year of the reign of King Josiah. We know he prophesies at least 23 years because he mentions that date also in his book, but we know that he goes beyond that. So he said back to 36:2, I want you to write down all the words that you've spoken ever since I called you, beginning with the days of Josiah unto this day. It may be that the house of Judah will hear all the evil which I will purpose to do unto them, that they may return every man from his evil way, and that I may forgive their iniquity and their sin. Then Jeremiah called Baruch, the son of Neriah. And Baruch wrote from the mouth of Jeremiah all the words of the Lord which he had spoken unto him upon a roll of a book. So you see, he's an amanuensis, a secretary here. Jeremiah is dictating, and Baruch is writing down all the words of the Lord that Jeremiah said. Jeremiah commanded Baruch, saying, I am shut up, I cannot go into the house of the Lord. He's held captive now. So he tells him to go and to read the words of the book. Verse 8, Baruch the son of Neriah did according to all that Jeremiah the prophet commanded him, reading in the book the words of the Lord in the Lord's house. And of course we know the result of that. The king becomes enraged over what he hears, destroys the book, but then the last verse of the chapter, Jeremiah is commanded not only to rewrite what he had written before, but to add words thereto. Then took Jeremiah another roll, and gave it to Baruch the scribe, the son of Neriah, who wrote therein from the mouth of Jeremiah all the words of the book which Jehoiakim, king of Judah, had burned in the fire, and there were added besides unto them many like words. So we're mentioning that because he's the famous one. We don't have the names of a scribe or a secretary of any of the other prophets show up, especially show up as frequently as the name of Baruch does. And of course, that's the way some of the books were able to get into things like the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha, by taking upon themselves names of famous people in the past. And of course, since we don't have any books by Baruch in the Old Testament, it's good to choose his name, to invent one, and to put his name to it, because he's the great scribe that followed Jeremiah around. He's the great secretary of Jeremiah. So if you've got his name attached to a book, then it adds credibility to one. Pseudepigrapha is another collection of false writings that were written after the Apocrypha. You've got BC pseudepigraphal books, and you've got AD pseudepigraphal books.
What religion has those books? What religion follows those books?
Well, the Jews, some of the Jews, yeah. They're written by Jews, some written by Christians. You've got books like the Assumption of Moses for Old Testament books, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Book of Jubilees, which is a book built on a 50-year division of history from creation all the way down until the present time the book was written. Then when you get to the New Testament, you've got the Assumption of Mary, the Gospel according to Nicodemus. You see, you pick out these other famous names that don't have books, like Nicodemus didn't write a book, but in the Pseudepigrapha he's got the Gospel according to Nicodemus, the Gospel according to Thomas, and all types of books. The Ascension of Isaiah, another book attributed to Isaiah. You've got many, many, many more books there than you got in the Apocrypha. And that, of course, will be studied in the literature class. That's where we'll come across that and look at all those different books there. Not as well known as the Apocrypha because it's not been accepted in any so-called Christian denominations, Christian circles like the Apocrypha has. But even the people who believe in the Apocrypha really don't know what they believe in. They claim they've only got 7 books, but they've got 14. That's because they add chapters to books we already have and just call them new chapters when it's an entire new book. But you end up with 14 books and not what the Catholics claim they have. It sounds better if you only added 7 rather than, 500 books to your Bible. You get the number down as small as you can and it sounds more acceptable to people. But they add 2 chapters on to Daniel, and each chapter is a whole book. And you get the history of Suzanne and the history of Bel and Dragon. You've got 2 new books on it. Aren't even related to each other. Not even related to Daniel either. Yeah. So that's where a lot of them, you got the letter of Jeremiah. See, Jeremiah, we see him writing several letters in here. And so besides the book of Baruch, you've got the letter of Jeremiah, which is another book. And the prayer of Manasseh. You see Manasseh making a prayer, but we don't see what's prayed. And so, see, that's what they want to do whenever you've got a scriptural proof here that Manasseh prayed a prayer, but it's not recorded in here, and someone just came along and wrote out the prayer. And now they've got justification for it because it says that he prayed a prayer in there. And so anytime you can find, when someone said this or did that, but we don't actually have all the events recorded, then someone just makes their own events and adds to that, and there you go. You've got a new book on your hand, too. He is known as the weeping prophet of the Old Testament. Remember, Isaiah was known as the evangelist of the Old Testament. Jeremiah's book is just nothing like Isaiah's book at all, just not even related to each other, because Isaiah is the evangelist. All of these great messianic prophecies, and the prophecies of salvation, and the prophecies of the millennium, the prophecies of the tribulation period. You just don't find those in Jeremiah. Different book, different type of ministry. And each of the prophets, especially each of the major prophets, generally have a nickname. Not all of the minor ones do. Some of them do, but your major ones have a nickname. And Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet of the Old Testament for 2 reasons. First of all, because of Judah's hardened heart. We see this in several places. Chapter 13 and verse 17. But if ye will not hear it, my soul shall weep in secret places for your pride, and mine eyes shall weep sore and run down with tears, because the Lord's flock is carried away captive. 14:17. Therefore thou shalt say this word unto them, let mine eyes run down with tears night and day, and let them not cease. For the virgin daughter of my people is broken with a great grief, and with a very grievous blow. And then in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. This is one of the reasons why he's known as the weeping prophet, because he's weeping over Judah's hardened heart. He can't get her to repent with all of his preaching and prophecy. Oh, that my head were waters, and mine eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people. Oh, that I had in the wilderness a lodging place of wayfaring men, that I might leave my people and go from them. For they be all adulterers, and assembly of treacherous men. Yeah. Then the second reason is because of all of its persecutions. He is the most persecuted of the Old Testament prophets. Chapter 12, verses 1 to 4. This is known as Jeremiah's great complaint. Jeremiah 12, verses 1 to 4. None of the literary writing prophets were persecuted as much as Jeremiah. Maybe that's why he doesn't have so many of the bright promises in his book.
Hallelujah.
Well, there's got to be a reason. That'd be as good a reason as any. He was too concerned with the here and now to dwell on the afterlife. Righteous art thou, O Lord. Now he starts off on a positive note. He said, Lord, you're righteous, but I want to plead with thee. Let me talk with thee of thy judgment. Wherefore doth the way of the wicked prosper? Wherefore are all they happy that deal very treacherously? Thou hast planted them, yea, they have taken root. They grow, yea, they bring forth fruit. Thou art near in their mouth, and far from their range. But thou, O Lord, knowest me. Thou hast seen me, and tried mine heart toward thee. Pull them out like sheep for the slaughter, and prepare them for the day of slaughter. How long shall the land mourn, and the herbs of every field wither, for the wickedness of them that dwell therein? The beasts are consumed, and the birds, because they said, he shall not see our last end. Then over in chapter 20, verses 7 and 8, see him crying out again. O Lord, thou hast deceived me. I was deceived. Thou art stronger than I, and hast prevailed. I am in derision daily. Every one mocketh me. For since I spake, I cried out. I cried violence and spoil, because the word of the Lord was made a reproach unto me, and a derision daily. Now, just to give you an example of some of his persecutions, look over in chapter 38. And we'll see some of the persecutions, beginning here with verse 4, that he experienced at the hands of his own countrymen. Because people don't like it when you tell them that their country's going to fall.
Oh boy, you don't do that.
We experienced a little bit of that. Never ceases to amaze me how many radio and TV evangelists prophesy that we're going to win America for Jesus. They just never read their Bible to make a statement like that. That America's going to turn around. There are very, very few ministers that you ever hear make a negative word against it. And generally those that do, they make a negative word, but then say, but I believe by God's grace and with your help, I can turn America around. And that's simply not true. And if you say that this country's going to fall, Jeremiah said your country's going to fall, and this is what he got. Therefore the prince has said unto the king, we beseech thee, let this man be put to death, For thus he weakeneth the hands of the men of war that remain in this city, and the hands of all the people, in speaking such words unto them. For this man seeketh not the welfare of this people, but the hurt. Then Zedekiah the king said, Behold, he is in your hand, for the king is not he that can do anything against you. Then took they Jeremiah and cast him into the dungeon of Malchiah, the son of Hamelech, which was in the court of the prison. And they let down Jeremiah with cords, and in the dungeon there was no water but mire, so Jeremiah sunk in the mire. And he finally gets Ebed-Melech over in verse 10 to draw him out, and God gives him a prophecy later on in Jeremiah's book that he's going to bless him. He's an Ethiopian of all things, but he's going to bless him and his posterity because he got 30 men and took Jeremiah up out of that pit. And that wasn't the only time. He's locked up time and time again. And just like Paul in the book of Acts, he's locked up by the king, and then the king comes to him and says, Do you have a word from the Lord for me? And Jeremiah said, I've got a word for you. I've got a word for you. And he begins to prophesy. And of course the king said, that's not the word I wanted to hear. And so he's in and out of jail, it seems like, all the time. Well, you could turn back one chapter there in 37:15, wherefore the princes were wroth with Jeremiah and smote him, and put him in prison in the house of Jonathan the scribe, for they had made that the prison. So you see, he's locked up in there. Verse 17, this is only one of several times where what I said took place takes place. Zedekiah comes secretly and said, Is there any word from the Lord? And look at this in verse 17. Jeremiah said, There is. For, said he, Thou shalt be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon. So, he came secretly wanting a word, and he got a word. That you'll be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon. So you're not always popular to be a prophet, but you'll get a prophet's reward for being one. And Jeremiah got his prophet's reward, but he wasn't always popular with people. It's interesting to remember that unlike Zechariah, he didn't end up a martyr. He ended up the only one surviving whenever the city finally fell. Doesn't always happen that way, but it happened with Jeremiah. Whenever the city fell, guess who stays? Jeremiah. Because he told all of them, the city's going to fall, and if you'll surrender, God will deal well with you in Babylon. And those that did make it to Babylon were dealt well with. They were allowed to plant vineyards and have their own homes and so forth. But too many fought trying to keep themselves out of captivity and died in the process. Of course, the famine that struck Jerusalem was terrible during this time. A fulfillment, of course, of Deuteronomy 28. Where God had prophesied specifically in Deuteronomy 28 that when you forsake me, I'll forsake you, and you'll eat your own children. And he said that in Deuteronomy 28, and it's fulfilled right here in the book of Jeremiah. As a matter of fact, that's what the Lachish letters are all about that we'll be looking at next week in biblical literature. The Lachish letters were written during Jeremiah's time. Some people even believe they happen to mention Jeremiah because they mention that old prophet. And they say it in such a way it seems to have reference to Jeremiah the prophet, because it's written during the same time whenever Lachish is falling, because Lachish, along with Jerusalem, was one of the last two cities to remain before Nebuchadnezzar destroyed them. Of course, Lachish fell before Jerusalem. But we'll see that in biblical literature, and you can tie that bit back in with the book of Jeremiah. He was a contemporary. Now you might want to get your chart out with several other prophets. First of all, he was a contemporary with Ezekiel towards the end of his ministry and the beginning of Ezekiel's ministry, because Ezekiel goes over in the second captivity into Babylon. Of course, Jeremiah doesn't go over in any three of the captivities. So he's a contemporary with Ezekiel. He's a contemporary with Daniel, who also goes over to Babylon. This is towards the end of Jeremiah's ministry here. With Daniel, with Ezekiel. He is a contemporary with Habakkuk. Habakkuk is the prophet questioning theodicy in his book. He's a contemporary with Nahum, and he could even be a contemporary with Zephaniah. Remember, we've got Zephaniah dated 640, so that pulls him about 6 years to the left of the mark of where you've got him on your chart. They've got him about 634. So you pull him over to 640, we really don't know how long his ministry lasted. If he's right on how long his ministry lasted here by showing about 10 years, then obviously Jeremiah and him could not have been contemporaries. But if he prophesied a little longer, then he would have been a contemporary with Jeremiah. And there you see Jeremiah's date, 627. It's one of the ones easy to date because he tells us in chapter 1 and verse 2 that he began in the 13th year of King Josiah. And so you see King Josiah there, and that would be his 13th year in 627 B.C. Now in chapter 25, we know this is at least 23 years later. And so we know his ministry lasted at least that long.
For the
We know this is at least 23 years later. And so we know his ministry lasted at least that long. By the time we get to chapter 25, verse 3, from the 13th year of Josiah the son of Ammon, king of Judah, even unto this day, that is the 23rd year, the word of the Lord has come unto me, and I've spoken unto you, so forth. But of course, what he goes on to say in chapter 25, this is where we get his great prophecy in verse 11, that Judah and Jerusalem will fall and serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. And we know he lives all the way up until the time when they fall, which is going to take us much longer than a 23-year ministry. 23-year ministry, it'll take us only down to 604. But then when we don't have the fall until 586, we've got to take Jeremiah through that. After Jerusalem falls, and Nebuchadnezzar puts Gedaliah as governor in the land of Judah, and of course Gedaliah is murdered by some people, by some fanatical Jewish nationalists. They murder Gedaliah and then all escape to Egypt, and they take Jeremiah with them. So that means that Jeremiah has to live during the time of Gedaliah, and however long he lives in Egypt, and if he comes back and lives in Judah, Palestine some more, we're not told, but then that's going to extend his ministry quite some bit. His isn't the longest, isn't even one of the longest, but it is a long ministry in comparison to someone like a Haggai or a Malachi. Now, while we've got our chart out, the greatest religious occurrence during Jeremiah's time is the discovery of the book of the law, 622, and that's on your chart. Discovered by Hilkiah, the high priest, who has the same name as Jeremiah's father. Now, of course, the greatest event that happens during Jeremiah's life is the fall of Jerusalem. One of the greatest events in all of the prophets. Of course, that's greater than the fall of Israel, because Israel was apostate self anyway. Ever since the time of her worshiping the two calves, she was an apostate kingdom. But the fall of Jerusalem is one of the greatest events in all of the prophets. But as far as Jeremiah's time and ministry is concerned, the greatest religious event is the discovery of the book of the law. Remember, according to the documentary critics, this is the book of Deuteronomy. When it's not discovered, it's just written now for the first time. Hilkiah writes it and hides it real quickly, and then pretends like he discovers it, and then attributes it to Moses, calling it a book of Moses. But of course, we already discussed that. That's simply not true. This is when the book of the law is discovered, which is told about over in 2 Kings 22, where Hilkiah plays a prominent role there. Let's see, I guess we need to leave this out for later on when we look at something else. Jeremiah is mentioned in the New Testament only in one book. What book is that? Matthew. He only shows up by name in Matthew. And how many times does he show up there? 3 times by name, but he's never called Jeremiah, though. Jeremy, he's called twice, and Jeremiah, he's called once. He's called Jeremy in chapter 2 and in chapter 27. He's called Jeremiah in chapter 16. Chapter 16 was the Caesarea Philippi confession of Peter that Christ was the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, "Whom do men say that I am? Some say that you're Elias or Elijah. Some say you're Jeremiah." So Jeremiah was a great prophet then, for some people to be calling Jesus Jeremiah. Jeremiah, the great prophet, resurrected. Then in chapter 2, I think the prophecy is about the weeping in Ramah. Yeah, in chapter 2, 17 to 18, then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremy, the prophet, Jeremiah 31. Then, of course, the other prophecy in Matthew 27, verse 9, really is a reference over to Zechariah. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremy, the prophet. In all cases, it should be Jeremiah to keep him in line with the Old Testament prophets. But that's the only place in the New Testament where he appears by name. Now, his prophecies are quoted other places, such as in the book of Hebrews, we see some of his prophecies quoted, and in several other places. But he only appears by name in Matthew.
What did you say about Matthew 27?
It's really a reference, or the primary reference is to Zechariah. If you'll notice the prophecy there, I believe you'll have a marginal reference. They took the 30 pieces of silver, that's in Zechariah chapter 11, I believe. No. We can explain that later on. The purpose of Jeremiah is to announce the impending destruction and deportation of Judah and Jerusalem. To announce the impending destruction and deportation of Judah and Jerusalem. Now you see, Ezekiel's living during this time, Daniel's living during this time, but they're prophesying about other things. I mean, Daniel's prophesying about a lot of things that haven't even been fulfilled yet in our day. Jeremiah is the contemporary prophet. He's prophesying not about these future prophecies and millennial blessings, but deportation and destruction now if you don't repent. So that's what differentiates him between the other prophets with whom he was a contemporary. Now, under the purpose, I wanted to mention 3 things. We see, first of all, God's great long-suffering in a very recurrent phrase that appears about a dozen times in his book. And this shows God's long-suffering and his faithfulness to present the people with the opportunity to hear the word and then have the word change their heart if they would only hear and obey. This phrase is seen for the first time in chapter 7 in verse 13. Seen for the last time in 44:4. We'll go by and look at these, and then I'll fill you in on the rest of them as we go. Chapter 7 and verse 13. You know what that phrase is yet? Rising early and sending, rising early and sending, rising early and sending. Dozen times he says it in the book. I'm rising early and sending, and rising early and sending. Always talking about sending the prophets and speaking by the mouth of the prophets, but you wouldn't listen. And now because ye have done all these works, saith the Lord, and I spake unto you, rising up early and speaking, but ye heard not, and I called you, but ye answered not, so forth. Verse 25 is another time. Since the day that your fathers came forth out of the land of Egypt unto this day, I have even sent unto you all my servants the prophets, daily rising up early and sending them. Chapter 11, verse 7. For I earnestly protested unto your fathers in the day that I brought them up out of the land of Egypt, even unto this day, rising early and protesting, saying, Obey my voice. 25:3. From the 13th year of Josiah the son of Ammon, king of Judah, even unto this day, that is the 23 year, the word of the Lord hath come unto me, and I have spoken unto you, rising early and speaking, but ye have not hearkened. And then in verse 4, the Lord hath sent unto you all his servants the prophets, rising early and sending them, but ye have not hearkened, nor inclined your ear to hear. 26:5, 29:19, 32:33, 34:14, or 35:14, 35:15. The last time is 44, verse 4. Howbeit I sent unto you all my servants the prophets, rising early and sending them, saying, O do not this abominable thing that I hate. But they hearken not, nor incline their ear to turn from their wickedness, to burn no incense unto other gods. Wherefore my fury and mine anger was poured forth, and was kindled in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem, and they are wasted and desolate as at this day. So God, we see first of all his response to rise early and to be faithful to send the prophets. What does Judah do? 2:28-11:13, your memory verse. Judah's response to God's long-suffering is simply to invent more gods to lean upon. And then just like a Cheshire game, it's God's move next, and he tells Jeremiah, don't ever even pray for this people again. And he says that 3 times in the book, beginning back in chapter 7, verse 16. That's the most awful thing God could have ever said to Jeremiah about Judah and Jerusalem, to tell his prophet, the only one that could turn their sins at that time and in that day, don't even pray for this people anymore. Jeremiah 7:16. Therefore pray not thou for this people, neither lift up cry nor prayer for them, neither make intercession to me, for I will not hear thee. So he simply warns Jeremiah and tells him ahead of time, don't even pray for this people anymore, because I won't listen to you. They've gone too far. Chapter 11 in verse 14. Therefore pray not thou for this people, neither lift up a cry or prayer for them, for I will not hear them in the time that they cry unto me for their trouble. Chapter 14 in verse 11. Then said the Lord unto me, pray not for this people for their good. In other words, if you want to pray, then pray for their damnation and destruction, because I'm going to do that anyway, whether you pray for it or not. But that way you'll get your prayers answered. Pray for them to be destroyed, and they'll be destroyed, and you'll get your prayers answered. But don't pray for their blessing, because you won't get them answered. Then it's interesting, in chapter 15, he doesn't use the same words, but he's saying the same thing in verse 1. Then said the Lord unto me, though Moses and Samuel stood before me, yet my mind could not be toward this people. Those were the 2 great intercessors in the Old Testament, Moses and Samuel. And he said, even if they stood before me, they couldn't turn my mind back towards this people. Okay, some remarks about Jeremiah and his prophecy. First of all, as I said before, he contains nowhere near the amount of comforting and reassuring promises that other prophets do. The only one we've covered so far is Isaiah, so I'll use him as an example that Isaiah has in his book. It contains nowhere near the reassuring, comforting prophecies. Most of his book, the vast majority of his book, is doom and destruction for the people. So this is why you won't find very many end-time prophecies in Jeremiah. He's got a few, like in chapter 30 he's got some, but very few will you find in Jeremiah, because he's a contemporary prophet warning the people of his day about their sins. Secondly, Jeremiah's got more warnings against false prophets and false shepherds than any of the other prophets. Because he has one around in his day, like Hananiah, who are false prophets and false shepherds. And all of the false prophets are telling the people things will get better. As long as you just keep on going in this way, things will work out for you. And so Jeremiah, he has to warn against that, because that's what was destroying the people. They were continuing to heed that counsel and go right along in their same old ways, doing just what all the other prophets were telling them to do. And it wasn't working for them. Things were getting worse and worse. And so Jeremiah had to stand up and make himself known. Thirdly, like Isaiah, his prophecy is directed towards Judah and Jerusalem. We'll be mentioning that with all the prophets. To whom is their message directed? Who is the recipient of the prophecy? We date his prophecy 627 B.C. It has to extend sometime beyond 586 B.C. His authorship is authenticated in 3 other places in the Old Testament. 2 Chronicles 36:21. Talking about carrying the inhabitants away captive to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbath. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years, his 70-year prophecy. A second place is Ezra 1:1. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, so forth. The third place where his authorship is authenticated is Daniel, chapter 9, and verses 1 and 2. The first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. The first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the rolls the number of the years, whereof the word of the Lord came by Jeremiah the prophet, chapter 25 of his book, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So his authorship of his book, or of a book, at least of chapter 25, is authenticated in these 3 other places. That means that his name appears outside of his own book in the Old Testament to show that other men, after his time, recognized that he wrote this prophecy. Now, what else does at least Jewish tradition tell us? We've already discussed that there is a possibility that Jeremiah wrote. Well, besides Lamentations. Kings. Remember, Jeremiah, we would assume, wrote 1st and 2nd Kings. But, of course, he's basically known for his book here, Jeremiah. Now, I want to look at some historical background for his book, which will finish this up for tonight, to get the time setting of the material that he's given us. See, it's been 100 years now since Israel and the northern kingdom has fallen. And for a time under Isaiah and Hezekiah, Judah and Jerusalem, the people of the southern kingdom, were able to stop the invasion of Sennacherib upon the city in 701. But now we're 100 years later. Jeremiah can't do anything to stop the people or stop the invaders from coming in because of the people's sin. During this time, we've got 3 great powers that are vying for world supremacy. Assyria is one of them. For 300 years, Assyria has been the dominant force in the Middle East. She's the one who took Israel in 722. She's the one also who attacked Judah and Jerusalem and tried to take it and the inhabitants in 701. But she is slowly going downhill. She's been a ruthless power. The Assyrians were ruthless individuals, and she's been a ruthless power for 300 years. However, she finally, let's see, where is that? There it is. She finally meets her max in the Battle of Nineveh in 612, which we'll study in one of the other books. We'll look at over in Nahum. But there are a couple of battles here that bring about the end of these great powers they were all vying for world supremacy at this time. All of these three powers here are vying for world supremacy in Jeremiah's day. And of course, two lose and one wins out. The first one that lost was Assyria, and she was defeated by the Babylonians, by the Scythians, and by the Medes in the Battle of Nineveh. And Nineveh fell in 612. That's the date you shouldn't forget, the fall of great Nineveh in 612. Another power that had been a great power 1,000 years earlier in the days of Genesis, in the days of Abraham, the days of Moses, was Egypt. It's been 1,000 years since she had been a great world power, but she too, like Assyria, is on the rise. She also ends up in a battle, 605, the Battle of Carchemish. She falls to Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. Now that ought to be on a chart in the back of your Bible, if you can find a map back there that would put you during that time period. So on the Euphrates River, not far from Haran, where Abraham sojourned from Ur to Haran before he went down to Palestine. It's right near there, and you see the little town of Carchemish. And there was a great battle here, fought between the Egyptians and the Babylonians. Do you see that on a map? It's on the upper Euphrates River. Northeast of Palestine and northwest of Babylon. Most of you seen that one. It's pretty high up there on the map. Pardon? She's on the rise. She's trying to gain the world. You can't stay at home if you want to become a world power. So she's headed up there to take on Babylon. You see, 626, remember, Nabopolassar was the father of Nebuchadnezzar. 626 begins the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And she had been on the rise, which brings us to our third power, and that's Babylon. And Babylon's never been this great of a power before. She had had quite a bit of prestige in the 1700s under Hammurabi, but not the military strength that she gained under Nabopolassar. In 626 was the beginning of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Chaldean, sometimes called the Chaldean Empire. And, of course, Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar, is the most famous one because he's mentioned so frequently in the Bible and because he's such a military expert and genius. And, of course, he's known for a lot of other things, such as all of his building programs. He married a Median prince and wanted to keep her at home. And, of course, the Medes were used to a lot of lush vegetation, and you don't have that in Babylon where the capital was, so he made the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and made it a virtual paradise there to satisfy his new bride that he had, make things look like home anyway. So this third power is Babylon. You see her on the chart beginning 626, Neo-Babylonian Empire with Nabopolassar. Then his son, Nebuchadnezzar. Then it goes on down the line through several other famous ones, such as evil Merodach, who's mentioned in the Bible, Belshazzar, who's mentioned in the Bible. Notice it's not a very long empire, 539 the end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the fall of Babylon in 539. So it didn't even last not even 100 years. But she conquered the whole world of her day. Took Egypt, took the Medes, took the Persians, took everyone that needed to be taken. And of course the Medes and the Persians turn right back around and take her. And they will of course become the next great power, but they're not a power in Jeremiah's day. It's Assyria, Egypt, and Babylon, the three countries that are straining to see who can become the greatest during their time.
For a complete list of Brother Ross's